to Daniel, of course, for this opportunity, and to Tiller Gallery. In this class, what became incredibly important was the question of images. So that's how we came to this. It's part of Chiara's work, and it has a long history in psychoanalysis, which I want to talk about. So the way that I want to do it first, though, is through the title of this exhibition, which is Totem and Taboo. And I happen to know from Daniel that one of the titles in which he was thinking about was Totem Sans Taboo, which might actually be the name of the book that will follow this exhibition. And I thought that this was fantastic because one of the truths about psychoanalysis is that we all know what a taboo is. A taboo is something that we think about, what we're not allowed to touch, what we're not allowed to image, something that's meant to be kept foreign, meant to be kept aside, but we never talk about the totem. And there's something very beautiful about what Freud says about the origin of human civilization in relationship to totemic culture. So what is the totem? The totem, Freud does this sort of strange anthropological research. Many people have criticized him for it, but I don't think it's so much whether it's right or whether it's wrong or whether it's accurate anthropology, but what he wants to do with it to speak about the human psyche. And what he says about the totem is that it's a binding agent. It's at the origin of civilization, and it's the way that tribes originally created clans within themselves to determine who belonged to whom. It was, in a way, the original family structure, but what's interesting to him is that it doesn't look like our heteronormative nuclear family. And one of the things he says is that it happens through the mother. So it's not the paternalistic family, it's a matrilineal lineage that's established through tribes. The way that it's established, interestingly enough, is that when the woman is pregnant, the moment that she feels the baby moving in her body, where she is at that moment, or whatever comes into her mind, establishes the clan that she's going to become a part of. So if you're near the water, you'll become part of the turtle clan. If you're in the woods, you become part of the bear clan. If you're in the fields, you become part of the rabbit clan. And that this was the logic that was used, as if at that moment the mother got to determine for herself who the father was. It wasn't the father of the baby, the one who she had a sexual relationship with, but who she is at the moment that she understands that she's a woman and a mother. And Freud says that what happens at that moment is she's brought into a clan, and from that moment on, all of the logic that organizes the family structure, what you can eat, what is sacred to you, who is your enemy, is the way that they distribute the resources within a community. So, of course, the people who are part of the turtle or the fish clan, they don't eat the fish, but it makes the fish available to the bear and the rabbit clan. And this is how they ensure a fair distribution of resources, and that they bind people together in a logic that's not necessarily one of ownership. Right? And it has something to do with laying claim to something yourself. Right, the moment that you decide to signify something, and also, of course, you're born into a clan, but you will change clans at another moment. And there's something here that I find incredibly intriguing in terms of a kind of fluidity of structures. Right, and everything that becomes a disaster for Freud happens once something about this totemism leaves the arena as an organization that sort of binds people together. Because what happens for him at that point is that it's not so much this maternal logic, right, but something, it transitions towards a kind of paternal logic once taboo becomes the more primary mechanism. So what is the taboo? So Freud says that what happens with taboo that's very different from totemism is that the taboo is established on the logic of the sacrifice. So he has this very crazy story that he develops as to how this transitioned, and he says that what started to happen was that the men wanted to take ownership of the women, right? And the father didn't like this way in which the mother was organizing things, distributing these resources. She was the one in charge. The father wants to keep all of these women for himself. He doesn't want them running off to the other clans, right? And the sons at that point get jealous of the father who's hoarding all of the women. They kill him. They feel very guilty for killing him. Then they establish a law, and that becomes the taboo. Thou shalt not murder, right? And thou shalt not murder, and also the taboo against incest. And he says this is the transition into what he's going to call at that point modernity. right? And this is for Freud. What's fascinating is he says that this becomes the sort of cauldron of our unconscious mind to the extent that our Oedipus complex is always based against these impulses. Obviously against being with our mothers and against killing our parents. And this sort of logic for him is very different because it's about both the active aggression and the radical fear of it at the same time that always keeps them in a very, very tense balance, and a fight and a competition. Right? A competition for resources rather than a system that allows us to distribute them amongst people. So this is what was important to me in thinking of this show. And I just want to fast forward now to why the question of the totem is important in psychoanalysis in the sense of today. So one of the ways in which Freud picks up on this again is that it's a form of identification that he says is with some representation that you find in the outside world. Now, the way that this comes into psychoanalytic practice is that what we see with patients is that they form a transference to you. The transference to you is based on something that neither they know nor do you know as an analyst. They find something in your person, they find something in the way you look, they find something in the way you dress, they find something in your office, they find something in your aesthetic, they find something in your work, in your mannerism, in your way of speaking, that they fasten onto as the point at which they consolidate a relationship with you unconsciously. What happens in a treatment is that this comes to the surface little by little. You start to understand why your patient, quote unquote, loves you, why your patient, quote unquote, is so interested in you in whatever fashion in terms of what you're saying. And this brings to the surface their history. It brings to the surface their trauma that they need to repeat with you in order to work it through. And it also brings to the surface eventually what's going to allow the analysis to conclude, because it's going to be made manifest, and then it's going to be allowed to dissolve, and then the analysis can come to an end. So this logic of what he eventually comes to call, partial identification, right? It's this like little details that you pick up on. I mean, of course, this is what artists are brilliant at, right? They pick up these little things that are invisible in the world and they make them visible. And psychoanalysis is almost like the entire analysis is an artistic act to the extent that it cultivates precisely this, making something invisible visible as what you orient yourself around in your world. And this
problem.
Well,
what then the problem?
Well, then the problem is that there's another form of identification, and this is the one that's linked to taboo. And Freud says that it's narcissistic identification, which I think picks up very nicely on the question of vanity that's raised by the performance earlier this morning. What happens in narcissistic identification is it's a way of shoving all of this history down, all of this trauma, all of this passionate, loving, desirous relationship to the world, and trying to create an image, trying to create a total image, trying to create a kind of narcissistic enclosure in order to fend all of that off and keep yourself together. But keep yourself together in a very lone, solitary, individualistic way. And Freud says that in the treatment you constantly have this kind of battle between partial identification, the place where you desire, the place where your memory is lodged, and this sort of total narcissistic identification. Both are imagistic, right? The one is the kind of tiny detail of what you pick up on when you get excited, and the other one is the thing that you're constantly trying to throw out there and portray about yourself, right? And I think that, the follow-up book to Totem and Taboo, I mean, Freud said that he was rewriting Totem and Taboo when he wrote Civilizations and Its Discontents, which I do think is his most important work in 1930, is basically the story that tries to talk about this war between trait identification, totemic identification, partial identification, and basically the narcissistic image, right? And it's what he's going to rename at that point in 1930, right? So we're moving from 1913 to 1930, Life and Death. He's going to rename it The Battle Between Eros and the Death Drive. And one of the things that he says in the conclusion of that essay is that he says that he hopes Eros will win. He hopes that love and binding and the binding of communities will win, but he cannot say for sure. right? And what you have to imagine at the point at which he writes it in 1930 is that all of the intimations of World War II are on his doorsteps, right? He's out of World War I, the Second War is about to happen. And it's really not clear to him that Eros can win at all against the force of this death drive. So this is, for me, the place where this exhibition is important because it brings these terms back to the table. And it also brings back these terms in a way that I think is fascinating that Chiara is going to pick up on, which is what is primitive, right? We have this incredible kind of juxtaposition of quote-unquote primitive artworks with Daniel's refashioning of them. But if you look at Freud's logic, which one is the more primitive? It's not the totemic, right? I mean, that's where we need to find ourselves again in relationship to some more interesting relationship of relating to one another, and not necessarily in the things that modernity has brought into being. So with that, I'm going to transfer it to Chiara.
Yeah, so here is the problem, because Freud wrote in the 30s, the beginning of the 20th century, in a situation in which we were not yet as image saturated as we are now. Right? We can, philosophers call that type of world the Fordist model of capitalist production, where people complain about their life being repetitive and alienating, doing always the same work over and over again. But we live in a post-68 society. What has 68 done? It brought to the scene the critique of this world by saying, all power to the imagination. We are done with this repetitive, alienating work. And capitalism reply was, okay, let's try it out. So what happened is that from the Fordist mode of production, where people mainly produce objects, goods, we moved to the current post-Fordist production mode, where all of us are constantly called to produce services. Services, images, creativity, participative management. We're constantly called to use our own creativity and our imagination for the sake of production, right? Producing always more. Now with objects, the Fordist mode of production, there's a limit. You can have 3, 4, 5 cars, maybe 10, like 15 washing machines, but then there's a limit. Like with services, there's no limit. That's where the expanding logic of capitalism needs to enlist imagination and artistic creativity for its own sake. In a way, we all are artists with our Facebook account. I mean, just that. So the problem is how to find an image that can keep us together and get outside of the narcissistic identification with the little images that we constantly see on our screen and profiles. And here is, I think, the importance of what Daniel's work has been doing up to now. If the 60s could still say all power to the imagination and imagine that artistic creativity would by itself liberate us, what are we going to do in a time where everybody has to be innovative, everybody has to be creative, right? You can't simply say all power to the imagination, because imagination has already all the power. So what is left for us? And I think that what Daniel has been doing with his work is a reorientation of the images. You can't get outside of the spectacular logic of commodities, images that are commodified, but what you can do, you can reorient them. You can subvert this commodified image from the inside. And what I see all of his work is this constant attempt to reorient the images we live by, and thereby to leave something of our unconscious drives, something of what has not yet been enlisted for capitalist production to break suddenly in. And moving to more to the topic of this exhibition, if I have to put Daniel's work in a slogan, I would say something like, against capital innovation, we need artistic reorientation. When moving to Totem and Taboo, and this idea Freud wrote in the 30s, that was the time of colonialism, like the big colonialist enterprise. People were fascinated by the primitives. They were fascinated by their totem. They were fascinated by their masks. And what they did, this is the logic of colonialism, they took artifacts from the primitive and they brought it in the metropoles. They brought it to London, New York, Paris, and inside of the houses. Like every good collector had the little image of the primitive in their house. Now this is, we may think that this expressed both the fascination and the repulsion. I mean, it's really the psychological logic of colonialism. You have to exhibit the primitive mask in order to first show it, but also close the discussion around it. This is the primitive. Though those are the primitive people, we are the civilized ones. So it has a function of reassuring in a certain image. So what has Daniel been doing with this?
What have you been doing with this?
Okay, I tell you what I see. For instance, look at this wall. So we have the little image, like the little artifact, and then we have these two painting, which are actually, I think, an excellent example of what I mean by reorientation of the image. So you have all the engravings from the 18th century. This is the Dutch, the Indian company, right? So the colonial enterprise par excellence. And both images, you have a group of men, notably sitting around a table, people of power, sitting in a room at whose walls there are paintings, right? There are paintings from exotic lands, maps. So the painting itself, the original engrave, reproduces this exhibitionistic logic of colonialism. So what has Daniel been doing? He has put in the middle of it, like in both images, this formless figure, which could be intestine, it could be excrement. It's something that immediately binds together, but it's something that certainly subverts the linearity of the image behind it. So it instead, I mean, what is this? It excites both fascination but also repulsion. I mean, it could be a piece of shit in a way. So this is, I think, the kind of reorientation of the image that he has been doing. And I think, to connect it to the performance, you said we have all these women and they happen to be women. That's absolutely not by chance, in the sense that we've seen in the performance as well. If there's something that, let's say, combine women and the primitive, is the fact that they are both associated with the idea of nature, right? Mm-hmm. They're both, particularly within the European modernity, there is this narrative which has associated both. So the woman is the one who's producing baby, taking care of the reproduction, and as such, she's closer to nature than the civilized man. So the difference between the two is that the primitives, they can stay naked, but women, they have to cover up for this connection with nature by their exhibitionism. And what we have seen in the performance is the typical example of female exhibitionism, so the covering of the body with adornment. Think about the difference that emerged during colonial time between men's dresses and women's dresses. Before that time, men were dressed with adornments and colors and as much as women, like wigs and everything. All of a sudden, men start to dress in suits. And even now it's the case. The president is wearing a suit as much as the first college graduate who was going for the first interview. There's not much of a difference. But think how much of a difference there is between different women clothes, right? So men have given up their exhibitionistic desire to show themselves because they don't have to. I mean, they are civilized by definition. On the contrary, women, they have to cover their uncivilized nature. So they have to...
And distract from it with all of this finery.
Right, exactly. and distract from it. So I think there's something in that connects very nicely the performance, the way in which the performance subverts this exhibitionistic logic that drives what it means to be a woman today, with the exhibitionistic logic of colonialism itself.
And just to bring it, this question of subversion back around to psychoanalysis, the one thing that I think we can associate with all psychoanalysis, there's so many different kinds, is the importance of dreams. Right? I mean, this is where it started, is that Freud wrote the interpretation of dreams. He analyzed his own dreams. He said that he had miraculously discovered that dreams had a meaning, which is just that they wish. And this is the founding act of this discipline and this therapy, is the fact that dreams have a meaning. But what are dreams? They're images. And one of the things that you do in analysis, when you do dream analysis, is that you take something that has this sort of compact imagistic form, even if it's a longer dream with a narrative. I mean, sometimes people really just bring you an image, right? Or they bring you essentially what are a series of images, and you deconstruct them, right? I mean, Freud said this is the iceberg metaphor, but you have the dream narrative here. When you find all the threads that go into it, that's the bottom of the iceberg, right? You see this huge mass of material get condensed essentially into what's an image. And this is what he says is fascinating about the human mind. Like, how can it take all of this? And, when you're sleeping, just throw an image out there, right, to contain all of that information, usually in a completely ingenious, sometimes very humorous, sometimes very terrifying fashion, right? And what you do in the work of a treatment is you try to take that image apart, show all of the different threads that went into making it. But I think in terms of what Chiara is saying about what we need to do today, or what art needs to do, it is about this sort of reorientation of the image. It's about a reorientation of it, it's about a deconstruction of it, it's a way of sort of breaking up the fixity of narcissism and of the death drive. I mean, this synthetic capacity to take life and just stick an image on top of it is both a blessing and a real problem, right? And this is the sort of double-edged life-death sword that Freud was juggling. Not only in Totem Taboo, but in its rewrite as Civilization and its Discontents.
There's also the topic of the mirror, which came out in the performance, and I think it's also nicely illustrated in Daniel's work. Something that I find striking in his work is the faceless character of a lot of the images. Now, psychoanalytically speaking, the mirror is the mirror face. The mirror is the one that gives you back the unified image, right? So you are living your life, and it's a mess, and you feel you're falling apart. But then you look at yourself in the mirror, or you look at the image on your web page, and it's unitary. It's nice. I mean, it can be more or less pretty, but let's say it's a unitary image, and there's your name, and here I am. This is what I am. So there's something in the very unitary character of the image, and that the mirror gives back to you, which is deeply misleading. I mean, it not only doesn't render the mess of images and drives, right? It doesn't render this mess, but it also traps you, because it's so nice to be that unitary self, which we are not, and it's so hard, on the contrary, to inhabit this mess that we are.
I just want to add one thing, but the big difference about the mirror of the performance is it's so terrifying to look into this mirror because you know you're being watched.
Right.
Mm-hmm. So it's very different from a regular mirror where you're just checking yourself out.
Right.
Like everybody is terrified from this. And for me, it's very difficult to do because I feel how everybody feels so uncomfortable.
But this is what is subversive about the performance, because on one hand you enact the submissive lady, who is just the mirror of the man greatness, and the aria is "Mi chiamo fedeltà," my name is faithfulness. I'm so faithful, so docile, so submissive, and then at the same time with what is it? If the mirror didn't have that space in between, it would not be so subversive. But what is subversive is the fact that this space in between your hidden face, again, the hidden faces, and also in Daniel's work, and it works as a sort of reminder that I'm watching you. And this is what is terrifying, is the fact that the familiar image of femininity with all of its adornment and nice dresses becomes this, she's looking at me, I'm being watched somehow. So I think that's what is terrifying, is a turning of the mirror against itself.
The dichotomy of the observer and the observed is represented in this particular artwork and in the entire exhibition, and sometimes the tribal artworks are turned away from us and towards the wall. Sometimes the paintings on the wall are looking at us, and also when the faces are obscured. For years I've sort of wondered why this interest in doing that, and it's not because I can't paint a face, it's because it offers the opportunity for the viewer to identify with the person in the painting, whereas if it's a specific person, specific face, it's the other. And the whole notion of this exhibition is I'd like to sort of play with that dynamic of the self and the other.
But you see, this the faceless image, the blurring of the image, invites you to identify, but it also prevents you from total identification, because it's blank, so you can't identify. It's not particularly nice. You can't identify with that face, which is so messed up. Right? So there's no linearity. So what you do, invite the onlooker to identify, but you at the same time you also block.
And also the
kind of simple.
Yes and no. I feel like, for example, this little girl here, I feel like the viewer can at least identify with an earlier memory of themselves as a little girl, or their own sort of subconscious.
But that's not identification,
Okay.
and that's more tied to something in the body or on the level of the unconscious, which is what subverts the image. And I think that that's also the quality in your work that tries to capture something about body and movement. I mean, there's a lot of your work that has this sort of feeling of something that's moving, which, you know, is why I love the moment in Freud with the totem, when it's, you feel your body. You feel your body doing something different than it had done the whole entire time. Right? And that's the moment in which you can create a new identity, a new family, a new orientation for yourself in the world. And, you know, just in terms of working with patients, it's this that they have to find again. Right? You come and you're anxious and you're numb and you don't remember anything and you don't know why everything's a mess. Right? And it's not just figuring all of that stuff out intellectually, but it's literally giving back your body a kind of life that it's missing by finding a way to dig back down through what's crusted over.
But at the same time, connecting this with your remark, look at the feet of the little girl. So what you see in the image, I mean, you either you always subvert the extremity of the body shape. So in this case, it's the feet, which are really slippery. And the way I read the image is that, first of all, there's the same aesthetic of recycling and reorienting of the image. The image is given strata and depth. The problem with the digital image of our time is that they're flat, they have no touch. So you build images which have depth and strata by using old fabric, and then you paint on top of it. And the image is a nun, so it's the typical pastoral power which reconnects with the colonial enterprise. We're bringing a religion and civilization to these savages. And the act of the body is the combing of the air, like, you know, this savage thing that we have here. Air, very subversive. And so the little girl is there, but look at her feet. I mean, she could slip away any time. She could literally liquefy herself and disappear. That's what is I think it's subversive in the image.
What's subversive is that there's a dichotomy in this painting of a simultaneous sort of the caretaker and the oppressor, you know, and that's something that I relate to as I was consuming images of colonialism in the preparation of this exhibition, and that sort of tension of the sort of
Should we open it to the audience? We've overwhelmed you with
the young lady.
I have not read your book, but I heard, and I hope this is not an oversimplification, but I read like a review or something that mentioned that the life and death of psychoanalysis. That you said something, that said something about ultimately psychoanalysis cannot be resolved, or it cannot be made like a finite, concrete thing. Like the trouble of psychoanalysis, a big way it stirs up so many conflicting opinions, is a good thing because it remains a subversive thing. And I was wondering what you said about, you know, the all-consuming power of capitalism, that it's taken our, you know, now turned creativity and art history into something productive. Maybe I was wondering if to kind of connect the two, that maybe we need to keep the subconscious away from capitalism in some sense. I don't know if you can speak to that.
Absolutely. One of my favorite quotes is from a sociologist named Philip Reef, who was really angry, in a good way. And he said that what he loved about psychoanalysis was when the logic of modernity and capitalism is that all time is money, right? I mean, we all have this problem. We're like, you know, gotta work. That psychoanalysis takes your money and it turns it back into time. And with that time, you do something completely useless. I mean, you just like talk about God knows, right? No, I'm serious. There's something about the inefficiency of it. It takes forever. You have to go all the time. I mean, you know, you're spending money on what exactly? But it's precisely this anti-capitalistic logic which needs to be preserved about it. And all of the therapies, right, with the idea of like, you know, get rid of the symptom, you know, do your worksheets, you know, go home and do your homework, come back, let's check your symptoms. This is not psychoanalysis for precisely the reason that you're talking about.
Right, but there's also something about the problem of psychoanalysis is one of the way to operate a reactivation of the productive imagination, so to speak. So a reactivation of a space where drives can and desires can just break free. But the problem is that it's an individual enterprise. So for me, the problem with psychoanalysis is that you can't put an entire society on the couch, right? And the fact that so it remains. I have to say, I mean, I think it's a problem. The most free people that I know are either people who have been psychoanalyzed or who are psychoanalysts, including the lovely lady here. But at the same time, they're not necessarily the most political. I mean, there's something that in the sense that there's something in psychoanalysis that is very individualistic. So the problem is how to bring that capacity for the liberation of the image outside of the analytic setting. And I mean, in the case of Jamieson, she's working on myriads of projects that try to do this. But I see artistic practices as another way to do the same thing through a mode which is more easily accessible, perhaps, and therefore by itself more political. Images travel outside of analytic settings and outside of closed spaces in a way that the psychoanalytic speech can't do, simply because it's so geared towards an individual path of liberation.
I'd like to ask, maybe as a provocation, with Sigmund Freud, one of his legacies was I think at least, the kind of transformation of what his nephew, Edward Bernays, came up with the term public relations.
Right.
So, amusingly enough, Edward Bernays based a lot of his analysis about how people respond to advertising and public discourse. So he then became an advisor for many commercial campaigns and advertising. But especially with the way this last election was fought over anxiety and perception, like Trump, you can put an entire society on this couch. It's just called Twitter. You know? So when you start thinking about this notion of public discourse and the commercial, let me think of this a better way, the commercialization of the subconscious maybe, it's become one of the best and most robust outlets for advertising.
Right.
So, Daniel, with your work, it's when I first walked in, I think there's a deep resonance with the painter Manuel Ocampo's work, or some of the Italian transvanguardia like Sandro Chia, Clemente, and Enzo Cucchi, in the 80s and 90s. But in an intriguing way, this is what I want to ask you, is where do you feel is the entrance for modern stuff? Because the 21st century is digital media, you're looking at photography, you're looking at digital media images, GIFs, logos, things like that. But in your work, it's much more of a kind of nostalgia, or going back to a different era, almost. It doesn't feel 21st century, but in a good way.
Sure. So I'll read a quote, and I'll answer your question. A given culture is only as strong as its power to convince its least dedicated member that its fictions are its truths. I think that the photographic image in the shaping of consciousness in the late 19th, early to the 20th, until the 21st century, has played a single-handed role in shape, because the image is a primary mode of communication for most people. I think it really has had the role, in any case, a printed image, whether it's an ad or the cover of the New York Times or a film poster or a painting, is a form of propaganda. Somebody is conveying to you their version of truth or reality, but we all know that truth is something that's subjective, right? But I'm taking the sort of the legacy of all the images of the 20th century. I'm using that as my database. So I'm looking through archives of subjects that I find relevant to this exhibition in particular, and I'm reappropriating those images. Whether it's deliberately I'm intervening on top of a photograph in the Troglopelia series, or I'm using the photography as an inspiration and sort of montaging different images, photographic images, in the form of an oil painting. But nonetheless, what my attempt is sort of to, like Jamieson and Chiara were saying, to sort of reconfigure the way in which images convey meaning in something that's not an objective sort of this is the truth, but more of proposing a question with the artwork, and then the answer is only in terms of the individual subjective interpretation of the image. So that's sort of how I was thinking about this exhibition.
If you think of the difference between the images at the entrance, where you have a typical digital image. What is typical of the digital image is the fact that it's flat, is reproducible, and in photoshopping time, it's no longer even an object, it's a process, because it can intervene in the very nature of the image from the inside. So the images have become these ongoing processes. The way I see his work is not simply the nostalgia, it's not just painting landscapes. What he's doing is trying to give to the image back a sensory depth, right? So the digital image can only speak to your visual register. It has no touch, no feeling of touch, no smell. It's impoverished. It's the poor image that contemporary art critic and philosophers speak about. So it's an impoverished image. What I see particularly important in his work is the stratification, is this aesthetic of recycling, the taking the old, precisely because we live in this age which is obsessed with innovation, pure creativity. I think that this aesthetic of recycling, of taking old fabric, right? This fabric, they have a feeling by themselves. Oil, in particular, give this sense of touch, but they also give a smell. They have a smell, this image, which is something that, and in particular, presented in this setting, which is a household, a brownstone. You can feel the fire. So there's a whole aesthetic of recycling, which also call for a more complex reception of the image. And in that respect, I think it's a very good homeopathic therapy. I mean, it's still images, so it's the image, but it's the which are making us sick to a large extent. But it's well, we have too many of them. I mean, that this is it's simply impossible to catch up with all the images.
And you're not even on Instagram.
And I'm not even on Instagram.
Imagistic consumption.
So I'm a very limited. But still, we're all caught into an excess of images. So the only thing that we can do is you can't call yourself outside of the image, but you can develop alternative ways to be in this world of images, and by giving back to the image this sensorial depth, I think it's a beginning. Maybe it's not the whole solution, but it's definitely a path.
Anybody have a question?
Yeah, so my mother's a psychologist, my father's a psychiatrist, and actually my sister's.
Sorry.
No, it's cool. we did okay, I think. My sister here is also a psychologist, and there's actually more in the family. But as we grew up in a house that had primitive art in it. And I think as a kid, I did not realize what a cliche it was. I think I just thought my parents were kind of quirky. But as an adult, I think I started to make more sense of it as primitive art, like maybe elements of psychoanalysis, is consciousness sort of valuing and fetishizing the unconscious, and the civilized fetishing and valuing the uncivilized. So I guess I'm hoping you guys can unpack sort of what that is and what that means. Is that envy? Is that the conscious envying what it is to be unconscious? Is that the civilized sort of... I've always kind of made sense of it as sort of envy in some ways.
I think it's envy on the part of the new psychologists for Freud that they'll never be. I mean, I find it sort of crazy that the psychoanalysts sort of remake his office, but they can't afford the artifacts that he has, and it's illegal to get them now. I mean, except when Freud, there was this trade, right, of like real artifacts. Now you can't. So all you can do is get the African variety of it, and then the psychoanalysts populate their office with this in precisely this kitsch fashion. I mean, it blows my mind. Like, what are you guys doing? No, but this is the problem with the image. Like, why are they making their offices in the image of Freud rather than reinventing something themselves as to what a psychoanalyst office could be now?
Because of the fetish.
Because of the fetish.
That's what I'm saying, the fetishing.
Because of the fetish. But this is also what's going to kill psychoanalysis. I mean, I could like go against my profession. It's very, very,
I can help.
But for Freud, it wasn't this. I mean, one of the things that Freud said with his desk, with all of these figurines. I mean, when you see his desk, it's crazy. I mean, where did he write? There was 100 of them on his desk. He said that he talks to them. I mean, it's not like, here I am with my primitive art collection, just like Freud. I mean, these were like people, he saw them as figures that animated his life, that he spoke to and spoke back to him. I mean, this is what I mean about the sensorial quality of it. It wasn't the fetish that says, hey, I'm a psychoanalyst.
We visited the house in London recently, and apparently these sculptures and statues were also a way to protect him from the patient and put a filter between him and his species.
No, but the psychoanalysts are not. I mean, the more general name for what you're describing is the discontent of civilization. Right? The psychoanalysts are definitely not the only one who have ethnic artifact in their houses. I do. I mean, maybe I'm equally. So to speak, infected by the discontent of civilization. But I mean, the fetishization of the ethnic product is a constant in all societies which have had a colonial past or something to do with colonialism. So you project onto the other both your disgust and your fascination. Right? So that's the desire for the primitive, and I think it's very interesting. I think the most representative series of work in the whole exhibition is the tribal philia. You see 2 pieces there. So these are images, original images from a book by Werner Münsterberger. Did I pronounce it correctly? right.
Munsterberg.
Munsterberger, that Daniel collected, and so he took these images. Now, this was a psychoanalyst. He collected all these images. He published this book. So there's clearly a fascination for the idea of the image as something primordial. And I always say, in this, I'm really on the side of the Jungians, there's something primordial about the image. I mean, the unconscious is in the first place a stream of images. So, but what Daniel has been doing is to take this flat image and just by adding colors, turning it upside down. I see in this both a desire for a totem. All those images are very fusional. So the desire for an image that glue us together. Again, these images are glued with one another. But I also see an attempt to reverse the simply exhibitionistic logic of colonialism, and psychoanalysts were no exceptions to this colonial desire.
Esther.
So I want to go back to something you said before, but it's not clear which one will win. If I understand, in the totem, where you have the sense of belonging, or in the artwork, you also have a sense of containment. And the civilization and its discontent was about the importance of sublimation in order to contain the unruly impulses. Because then you would have a victory of death, or hatred, or oppression. And it's no longer the playfulness between the voluntary submission. It's very clear that there's no voluntary in it. So my question to you about the flatness is, I am afraid that actually in this particular moment the victory is kind of clearer than you are alluding to. That flatness of Twitter or any of the other things is a platform for primitive, unruly impulses gone wild without no container and a false sense of belonging.
I think you're absolutely right. I'm completely terrified of what's going on in the world at the current moment. I think the one thing that I would add, that there's something that Freud talks about that's very important to me in Civilization and its discontents, which is that the battle between life and death, he says, is eternal. It's a struggle that's going to go on forever. He speculates that there might be a point that the death drive wins out and we decimate ourselves as human beings, right? And he says this is possible from what I understand now about the human mind. The place is sublimation. Yes, we have to find ways to creatively produce and contain ourselves through images, by the way. I mean, if you look at sublimation, it's artistic productivity. The problem is, he says, it takes a lot of frustration. I mean, for anyone who makes anything, it's not like you just produce something. You struggle and struggle and struggle at it, and it's not exactly pleasurable. There is one tiny little space that he makes for the accommodation of the drives that's not simply sublimation. He says that the world itself can recognize that the ways in which we experience pleasure and unpleasure as human beings is very unique. And that we need to create laws or ways of binding together that recognize this variability in humanity. Right? So when you have a kind of edict that's like, you better work really hard and you better take care of your family, we all need to do that in very different ways. Right? Or if you have a kind of religious ideal that says, you have to be a good person, you have to care about the person next to you, it doesn't function as a way to make people care about each other, which we know it becomes this kind of voracious command that we then rebel against, right? Or we identify on the aggressive side of it, right? Rather than what it's trying to do to tell us how to relate to one another. So he really hoped that there could be ways that we could recognize this variability in what he called the pleasure principle. And I don't know. I haven't really been able to think it through, but I wonder what other ways we can find both of recognizing this diversity in human life and having it find a form that can then bind us together to create new containers. I don't know, but it's the project that is absolutely urgent.
Maybe you want to talk about your dear Ivanka in that respect?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's a good example of why I didn't respond to your question. I mean, Twitter could never put a society on the couch. I mean, the idea of the couch is precisely the idea of a very specific experience, which is made by the being in this body-to-body relationship with another speaking body. So it's not simply words. Words can be totally empty in terms of in terms of their content. I mean, the point is not having people say, "Yes, fine, it's true. I'm in love with my mother." I mean, or with my father. I mean, that's not the point. Is not simply to transmit a series of truths or even fictions or falsity through a media. Is to go through an experience which is very bodily. It's a body that you meet in the setting. It's a speaking body. Otherwise, the talking cure could be any word cure, but it's not any word. It's just a very embodied word.
I got sucked into this dear. I mean, just because you brought it up, I got sucked into this dear Ivanka movement, which we didn't expect it to have the impact that it had. But the idea is precisely what you were talking about, Esther. It was to take some sort of flatness that I saw. One is Ivanka Trump. I mean, we have this idea that she's really sweet and articulate and nice and a mother, and she's cares about women, and she's this moderate ear that's potentially present in the Trump administration. And to kind of explode this, and to explode it also in the fact that she's a brand. I mean, she has branded herself very, very well, and nothing about her should be normal. So we've juxtaposed all of these images, which are in the world. I mean, this woman's entire life is captured in images, and we're trying to kind of recycle them violently through this Instagram account, which in 1 week has 14,000 followers, and we had like 50 articles written about it in the newspaper, and it has damaged her brand. I mean, it sort of blows my mind that we did this, but I sort of feel very bad, but not really. So, I mean, my problem with it is that on the one hand, that's trying to get rid of the flatness, or even to expose the sort of crazy family romance fantasy that we're having as a nation. You know, to sort of show that their weird incestuous relationship, to show actually the confluence in their narcissism with one another. But this doesn't do something positive. I mean, the only place where the thing that I was talking about that I can see is that in the trope of Dear Ivanka, you're, as a group of people, were like pleading with her. And it's been very important to people to the extent that they're writing letters like, please Ivanka, protect my family, please Ivanka, care about climate change, please Ivanka. So I love that as a way of like bringing a kind of quasi-religiosity as like a binding element amongst people.
Serena?
It's a bit late, but I just wanted to, you were before talking about the woman just going out into the forest or to the water, and wherever she feels the movement of the child, that's where the child is going to be at home. So what I find so fascinating in the feminine matriarchic society versus the patriarchic society is the whole idea of ownership. So the male has kind of, first this is my woman, this is my child. And then with the whole colonialism, they go to these tribes where they don't have a notion of ownership, and they take these sacred objects that don't belong to anyone, and they take it and put it in their house. And by making it, you're taking ownership, you're kind of demystifying it. And what I think is actually happening is the consciousness pushing down the subconsciousness and taking ownership. I know you, I own you, I put you in, you're beautiful, but basically it's like saying to the woman, you're beautiful, and by saying that, you take all her power away. So the idea of ownership in our capitalist and patriarchic society, I think, is our biggest problem. And every time you take a picture of something and you put it on your Instagram account, you're taking ownership of it. Every time. And I think that's where we're kind of sick.
That's what I love about these objects, is that they're inherently paradoxical, because they're simultaneously possessions, but yet they represent this this opportunity for the collector or the owner of them to impose his own repressed anxieties and fantasies onto what they represent for him. And I think that also you were sort of fetishizing Freud's collection as being somehow archetypal and different because he was the first one. But from my understanding and talking with Alan Steele, who's the collector whose objects are in this room, that actually his collection was quite inferior. Mm-hmm. It wasn't really, he was not a connoisseur of any sort. It just, they mostly had a totemic value for him, and they sort of, they provided, and Louise Bourgeois wrote an essay called Freud's Toys, in which she sort of expressed her dismay about the fact that they simply served as a veil to protect him from his patients. Anybody?
Maybe one other question.
Yeah, I'm intrigued about the fact that the objects we have here are extricated from not just a different place. That's no problem. I'm not making any kind of political statement. It's more about the fact that your work is so much about, it seems to me, the raw and the cook. The very fact that the support is so active and is appropriated, the images are vestigial, and that interaction, I think, is what very much defines the work. So I think juxtaposing with these artifacts is kind of fascinating, because these objects are in fact Western art objects, because they've been extricated from what's essentially a performative culture. To the makers of these artifacts, in their present condition, they do not have their original meaning. They would have been used in ceremonies, and they only have a life or a legitimacy in the hands of the makers when they're being used in those ceremonies. But to Western connoisseurship, they are containers of kind of a formal purity. The fact that we're seeing objects that might once have been coloured in a denuded state, I think that really speaks to what's happening in your painting as well. So I wonder if we have any insights into the repurposing, the retooling of these objects, and the aestheticizing of them, which is not a bad thing. It's not a critique. I'm not joining that kind of post-colonial shock horror. These belong to someone else. They don't. They had fulfilled a function once, and now they have a new function. So, does that all make sense? Does that all tie together?
I mean, one of the things about the totem is its ceremonial aspect. I mean, it's about what you eat. It's about eating together. I mean, it has long passages about like how important it is to eat together, right? As opposed to just be your family name trump. And Chiara brought up that this is almost a performance in itself with these artifacts. I mean, we're here, we're in a salon, we're drinking together. So I think that's important just in terms of, and you set it up this way. I mean, you always from the beginning had the idea of having it in this house with these salons, with eating.
In this sense, it's really subversive, because what you are talking about is the birth of art, like in the sense that that's a typically modern thing. Not just the primitives, but Greek art, religious art, medieval art, where we call it art as if it was its purpose was simply aesthetic contemplation, but they all were part of social life. So the idea that you would have a museum to exhibit the pieces of the Greek temple, that would have been inconceivable for the Greeks. I mean, the temple was the temple. The totem was the totem. So it's not, I mean, there's no judgment here. I mean, it's as simply as a matter of fact, art, the idea of using object for pure artistic pleasure, it's a modern thing. And in this sense, this movement of having these species exhibited in a brownstone, so in a family or a communal space, as opposed to being where there's food downstairs, there's drinks, there's the fire, there are people gathered together, bodies. it's very different than the typical museum space where the predicate is the separation of the aesthetic experience from the rest of life. So now, there's a whole aesthetic of everyday life which is emerging today, which I think it's a good thing. I mean, the idea of recovering the continuity in between the aesthetic experience and the other processes of life. Like, let's drink a glass of wine together, let's talk, let's have an intellectual conversation, and bring a psychoanalyst and a philosopher. We don't really know what we're doing. But it's life, right? So in this sense, I think it's very, in a way, I don't know, postmodern, anti-modern, call it whatever you want, but it goes against the grain, which is the separation of art from the other process of life.
I mean, the flattening and the excess democracy of social media and Twitter and well, particularly Instagram, Tumblr, etc., democratizing images to make every image immediately consumed and within that white space of the screen is an extension of the museum as a frame.
And the individualistic consumption of it, right? Because the idea is that you go and you have this solitary, quasi-religious experience in front of a painting, which is now like this.
Here an example.
All right, one last question.
I think it's important that we realize that Totem Taboo was written in response to Jung's work, which would address that conflict.
We have this problem all the time.
We have this problem because I'm the Jungian and she's the Freudian, and I keep saying the image is primordial, and she keeps saying language is primordial. So like it's that's where we are the living contradiction.
It's the primary process is image.
Yes.
Perceptual.
Yes.
Linguist.
But wait a minute. If we look at what if we look at what the totem does, it takes the mother's feeling in her body, yes, an image of an animal, but also Freud says that this image of the animal is the first form of writing. Writing is inherently linked to speech in an important way, right? So you have body, you have image, and you have language. And I think when Chiara says image, I think she means all of these things. And when I say language, I'm trying to fuse them all together. So I mean, I think fundamentally we agree, and this is like a terminological, like silly academic argument. I'm a Jungian, it's fine.